Great. So let's get started, and we'll see if anybody else wanders over, but if not, it'll be the power trio here. So today, we're wrapping up the REST API that we started. And we've done quite a bit over these days, talked about what REST is, built the beginnings of a REST server. And now, what's left, let's see, so next up, we're going to write the database functions to update a contact, and then we're going to finish up the routes. So getting a single contact, creating a contact, deleting a contact, updating a contact. And we'll try to do this as quick as possible, leave time for questions and anything else. So just taking a look, this is our API so far. We've got a get route that gets all our contacts. We've got database functions for get all contacts, get contact, create contact, and delete contact. And so now we need to do update contact. And just a heads up that I added this little bit of magic here. It's called PG Monitor. I was just reading about it yesterday. The idea is that it will log in the console any queries that are sent to your database. And so we can just see what those are, which can be helpful. Cool. So let's write this function real quick. What do we want this one to look like? Yep, const update contact. What are we going to take in? ID? So we want ID and first name, right? Because if we're updating the contact, we want both which contact it is and we want the fields that we're updating. So first name, last name, and phone num is how we had it. Yep, return db1.
Are you recording, Justin?
Yes. Yes, I am. Yeah, 1 second. Okay, so you said update. Contacts. So we're updating contacts. Set. Yeah, what we're going to update. And for the purposes of this, we're going to just say that every time we do an update, we're updating all fields. And I'll say a little bit more about that, but that's going to keep it a little simpler for us right now. We could, if we wanted to, we could do some logic here to figure out which fields to update, but we're not going to. Not for this. So a couple ways to do the syntax, but I think the easiest way is first name, last name, phone number, and then equals. And then we'll put in some parameters here. So let's do 2, 3, and 4. And it's 2, 3, and 4 because we want to put the ID first just to be consistent. Where, doing great, Mira.
First name, last name, phone number. I know where first name equals $.
So that would be looking it up by first name. So like, let's find the contact with name Sally and update that.
No, ID.
By ID, yep, that's right. Contact ID equals, and we'll do $1 there, and returning star. And with Postgres, this returning in this case should give us whatever rows were updated, which in this case should just be 1 because we're looking it up by the ID. Yeah, so in here, we're going to pass in as parameterized variables here. For number 1, that's the contact, or we just have it as ID in the up here. So it's just ID, first name, last name, and phone number.
And why are we passing this in?
As what?
Why are we passing this array in?
Does anybody remember from?
When you run this command, it will, in the console, we will see that array.
So there's a specific reason that we do this way, right? Because in theory, we could actually do first name. We could do this here using template strings, but this is absolutely a bad idea. And the reason is because of SQL injection. And so we talked about this a little bit yesterday, but the bottom line is there are some scenarios in which if you're taking in information from the public, so somebody's entered stuff into a form or it's coming in through an API, if you're taking that data and you don't really know what's in it, I mean, hopefully it's a first name, but maybe it's something else, it's possible to put SQL in that. And then if you just kind of blindly paste it in there, there are scenarios in which they can run commands on your database and screw things up. So instead, we use this particular syntax for PG promise, which you can use numbers to access the elements of an array, and it's actually not 0 indexed. Notably, it's indexed from 1. You can also pass this an object that has ID, first name, last name, phone number, and then access it by the property name. But this will be fine. This is easy for now. So that's why we do that syntax. We're going to just return that, and looks good, right? So we've got delete, update, create, get, and get all contacts. So let's export these all. So we've got update, contact, and let's export close connection, which the close connection, do you know why we have a specific function for that?
Isn't that something you told me about, like the database will just keep the connection open, waiting for another, I don't know, SQL call until you tell it to close, and it can like lag your system?
Yes. Yeah, so PG promise will keep your database connection open for 30 seconds after the most recent query. And so if you're doing like command line SQL with promises, for example, you may have noticed this, that if you run a SQL command and then you're all done, the thing it doesn't go back, it doesn't exit right away. So in that case, it's very useful to call PGP end, because that says don't bother waiting for another one, we're done, and then you can exit right away. It may not play a role in this because we're currently having a web server that is just constantly listening for things, and so it can keep that connection open, and it doesn't really matter. But good to export it, because down the line we may need a function like that, and we've written it, so let's export it. So now let's import these into this API file where we're defining our REST API. Yep.
So I know what you're doing, but how would you explain
which part?
When you're writing SQL functions?
Mm-hmm.
How, like, what would you say you were just doing?
I would call that. I would just say writing my database functions. You're writing what you're doing is you're creating an API for accessing your database. In this file, we do not, and this is our API file. In this file, we do not want to be doing any SQL, right? This is the separation of concerns. We want to do SQL in stuff that's specifically, related to the database. And in an API file where we're defining what our REST API is, but instead of doing SQL, we just want some commands. We just want some functions, is what these are. And so we've created a mini API for ourselves by writing those functions so that instead of having to deal with SQL, all we have to deal with is a function call. Make sense?
Yeah.
And you'll do this a lot. This is kind of the backbone of programming with when you're doing like more than one file, or when your program gets more than a couple lines, is you separate things out into kind of logical groups, and then you expose an API, which is usually just a list of functions, to the rest of your code to use. Right? So I've just pasted in here all of these. We don't need closed connection right now. So we've got these 5. Currently got a route for get contacts. So let's do our get contact route. So this is a route where we're not getting all contacts, we're just getting a specific one. I've just copied and pasted this here. What is this route path going to look like here? Slash ID. Yep. And do we remember what this is called? It's a parameter, not a query parameter. It's a URL parameter. And if you really dug into it, like, it doesn't make 100% sense that it's called that, because query parameters are also in the URL. But you know, this is just what we're calling it. This is a URL parameter because it's in the path here. And if we had, you know, something in our URL that was like this, and then, you know, name equals whatever, that's a query parameter. Cool. So we're at the contacts endpoint, and we're getting a specific instance, a specific ID. So what do we want to do here? We'll do get contact by, and now what do we put in here? How do we access that ID? Does anybody remember?
Can we look at the database file?
Well, the database file won't tell you. We can look back at our server.js, because we did this once before, where we got a word here. Remember this? And you access it through rec params. Yeah. So so we could do rec.params.id. I like doing it this way instead, where you do const ID equals rec params. Because that way, if you ever have to access the ID again, you just access ID. You don't have to do rec.params.id.
Why did you put your constant?
Say it again.
Why did you wrap your const ID and object literal bracket?
Yeah, so this is an interesting thing about ES6. Who remembers what this is called?
It's the same as if you would say const ID without brackets equal rec.params.id.
Yep. This is exactly the same.
Oh, I see.
This works exactly the same. This actually isn't an object literal here. And you can tell because it's before an equal sign. Like, if you put it after an equal sign, we'd all know that means we're creating an object. The brackets are used in this case for a different purpose. So brackets in JavaScript are used for a handful of things, and it can get a little confusing. But in this case, this is the destructuring syntax. Yeah. Yeah, and probably not ultra important that you know that word, but very important that you recognize this, and what's going on. So we're saying we're pulling ID off the rec.params object.
So you don't want to create that separate variable just to put it as parameter and just so that don't create extra variable.
Yeah. So are you asking about why do this versus just?
Yeah.
Yeah, because one of the reasons I like it is because when you're scanning your code, it's pretty easy what parameters you're using. So you can look at the top of this function and you can say, oh, okay, well, I'm pulling off the ID parameter and the first name parameter and the last name parameter. And you can just see it all in one place. It's a matter of style. You won't be docked points if you do it this other way where you have rec.params.id. But this is the style that I like because then you can access ID here. And if we needed to say there was an error accessing ID, we could do ID down here and wrap this in backticks. We could do it there too and not have to do rec.params.id there. So we'll pull off ID, we'll get contact ID, and then we will get some data back from the database. If the promise resolves positively, so if it resolves, we're going to go to this then. If the promise rejects, right, then we go to this catch. So the database function, the database call may have a problem. There may not be this particular ID, or we may have a typo or something like that. Whatever it is, if there's a problem with the database query itself, this promise is going to reject, and we're going to go to this catch thing here. But in all likelihood, we'll go here, we'll get some data from the database, and then let's do a res, send it with a status, and in this case, 200 makes sense, I think. And we'll send the data. Now, like this comment says, it would really make sense for us to do JSON here because we are doing our API all in JSON. People send us JSON, we send JSON back. That's a pretty common standard at this point. There are other ways to do it. You could theoretically send anything. You could send CSV, you could send XML, you could send whatever, but JSON is the way to go. And because we're sending JSON, it makes sense to use the JSON function, which sets our content header and knows specifically to serialize this into a string. We can take this comment out, and let's just do that up here too. JSON. We're good so far? Following so far? Okay. So we've got get contacts ID, and let's check it out, see if it works. So let's make sure the server is running. If the screen is ever too small, or if the text is ever too small, just let me know. I'm happy to change things around. So npm start. Server is running, that's a good sign. So now let's, so what kind of request is it? Get, yep. Which is the one that we use for reading. So we're gonna get from localhost 3000 API contacts. So just for fun, let's get the list of contacts first. Okay, so we've got our contacts, we've got Bonnie and Jedi and James and Jack and Mira and Jen and Annie and Sally Field. So now, let's get a specific contact. Which one do we want to get? 6. Let's get 6. And there it is. It's just Jen. And it turns out, so this is exactly the way that Postgres has returned us this information as a single object. And it turns out this is probably the best way to send it also. We don't have to massage the data. We don't have to change it around. We don't have to put it in an array. If we're accessing a single instance of something, it wouldn't make sense to put it in an array. I think it makes most sense to just send the object. So good. We can go and get 1, and that should give us 1. And let's just see what happens if we get one that's not in the database. So we get our error.
Now, is this the appropriate amount of information that you want to be accessing to is the content type of JSON or response.json, or like would this also work for like URL encoded? I'm trying to parse out when to use what type of my type in the content.
So the URL encoded, if you're receiving that, that's going to be what you get from a HTTP form or an HTML form, right? So that's the
That's like information coming from your front end.
from your
From your.
exactly. Yep.
Okay, so that. Okay, I see.
Yeah. So if it's information coming from a front end form, now you can make AJAX requests from the front end also. And if you were doing that, you could make an AJAX request and send JSON. And that would actually be the way that I'd recommend doing it. So cool. So let's keep plowing through here. So we've got our get all contacts, and we've got our get single contact route. What's up next? Let's create a contact. So yesterday I said we could use put for this. I think that still makes sense. So let's use put. And remember that router takes many of the same commands or has many of the same functions as the Express server in general, but we create a router so that we can separate out our different routes into different files and then kind of bring them all back together. So router.put is just like app.put. It's the put method, and we want to do that to what path? So I'm glad you said that. That is incorrect, but it's a very common misconception. And the thing to remember about this is nouns, not verbs. Our rest routes are always nouns, not verbs. And if you put create in there, that would be throwing a verb in there. The verb is always the HTTP method that you choose. And
So would it be contact/new?
You don't even have to do that. If you access the contacts route, so if we went to the contacts route with a get, we can know that we're trying to read something. If we access that same route, but with a put, yes, yep. So it knows we'll be putting in information, creating information. So we'll say this is the create route.
And what is the method that updates one or updates like
Put is the one where you have to send all the fields. Yep. So great. So then what do we want here? We don't need this ID. They're not passing an ID through the URL parameters, but what do we want?
Don't we want the function that we wrote to, or the SQL query that we want to select all and, or not select all, but to insert information?
Yep, and the one that we wrote that uses an insert is this create contact. I love that people walking up above make the whole screen shake. Yep, so that's our create contact. So that's the function that we want to use. But we need to pass that function some things, create contact. So what are we going to pass it, and where do we get those things? Yep. So we're taking first name, last name, and phone num. So how is our client sending us the information for this new contact? Not in this case. We could write a route that takes in form data from a like HTTP form or HTML form. I keep saying that, HTML form. So that would be like if you had a web page and you were like, click here to add a new contact. But we're making a REST API. And REST APIs are how you programmatically interact with data. Say it again. So in this case, it's not query parameters. It's going to be in the body. 10 points for Debrina. Right? And this is what we were doing in Postman, right? There were some routes where we would do like a post or a put, and we would give it a body that was some JSON, and then we would actually put some JSON in the body that said like what we want to send to the server, right? This is a real crucial part to get. So, shake your head if you're not getting it. So how do we access things that are on the body? Request.body. And we can use the destructuring syntax to get, so what we're going to say, and you'd want to like publish a web page that describes this, that tells people how to use your API. But what we're going to say is, if people want to create a contact, they should use the key first name, the key last name, and the key phone num. Now it happens that those are the same ones that we use for our database. It doesn't have to be that. So here we could tell people, when you're using our API and you want to create a contact, send first underscore name, last underscore name, and number, just number. So it doesn't matter what we put here. You want to make some smart choices about like what's going to be a kind of logical variable name. But just for the heck of it, we're going to use the same naming scheme that we do for our database. And we're going to get this off of rec.body. What? That's the destructuring syntax. That's the destructuring syntax.
Request.body, first name, request.body, last name. That's what that means, right?
What needs to be in place so that we can actually get this JSON information from the body? Body parser, bingo. This is like that super important thing to remember, is rec.body it's not assigned any value without body parser. But what we have is this middleware installed that when a JSON body comes in, it says, oh, I know what to do with this. It's a JSON body. I know because of the content type. So I'm going to parse this, and I'm going to put all the things that I parsed, so it probably has a first name and a last name and whatever. I'm going to put that on rec.body.
So whenever you use rec.body, anytime, body parser.
Yeah, some type of body parser. So there's body parser for JSON, which when we set that up, that looked like this. But if you were getting data from an HTML form, you would use this one, the URL encoded extended false, right? So it's just real important to understand the role of middleware, what middleware is doing when it's happening, right? It happens after the request comes in, but before we get to this route. And
say that again, it happens after the request comes in from the browser, but before it goes to the server.
yes, and that's what makes it middle. What's that?
It happens inside the server.
Inside the server.
Inside the server, it's almost like the hallway when you walk in.
Bingo. Yep. Because it happens in the middle of a request coming in and a response being sent. It's in that middle. So that's why we call it middleware. So because we have body parser, we get rec.body, first name rec.body, last name rec.body.phone number, and we can access it this way. So we're going to create a contact. We don't specify an ID because our database is going to do that for us. It's going to create an ID automatically. So we want to send first name, narm, first narm, last name, and phone number. And then, and don't quote me on this, but my experience is that when you do something like creating a contact, what you might send back is the contact that was created. Another option is you could send back the route that you can access that contact at. That would actually probably be my preference, is to send back instead of just the data here. What's that? Good question. So we're not wanting to redirect, but what we might do is send a JSON object that says, yes, yep. So we might send a JSON object that says, there's going to be a better name for this, but I can't think of it. So we could send like new contact, and then we would say HTTP / and then whatever our domain is. In this case, it's localhost. Localhost 3000 API contacts, and then here we would figure out what ID our contact got, and paste it in here, the new ID. Now, why would that be a good idea? Because if someone's creating a contact, there's a good chance that they will want to know pretty much right away how to access that same contact. They might not use that, but the idea with an API is always to try to provide the most relevant and useful information to whoever is using your API. And so this is what I would probably prefer to do. We would have to look up the ID from the response, and we could probably do that. I wonder if we can just do const new ID equals data, right? Because the create contact was just a create, we use db1, so it's going to give us just one row back that's whatever we created. So maybe this will work. I don't actually know if this is going to work. But the purpose of this is to get the ID in the database of this new contact that was created, and then we're going to send it back here how to access that contact. There was an error creating this information, right? So let's give this one a shot, shall we? So our route API, not weave. We're going to do API contacts, and so we're posting just to we're putting just to contacts. And in here, we want to put whatever contact we want to create. So first name, what should it be? Yeah, let's put me in the database. And remember that when you're using Postman like this, JSON needs quotes around both the key and the value. That's not true in JavaScript. Last name. Does anybody know how to say my last name?
Is it Haheim?
Yeah. Yeah, Haheim. H-A-A-H-E-I-M.
Is it Dutch or German?
It's Norwegian. So my wife hyphenated her last name when we got married, and we joke that she has like the least spellable, pronounceable name ever. Her full name is Nikisa Florit Whitaker Haheim.
That's awesome.
She'll love that I mentioned that. And phone number, we'll do 888-888-1234. Cool. So we've got the right route. We've got the body. The header content type is automatically set because we chose JSON in here. That's a handy thing that Postman does. So let's send, see what we get. Contacts undefined. So let's see if it actually hit the database first. So we're going to go over to Postico and refresh. And I'm in there.
Yeah.
So that's great. So the thing is, we don't know. Oh, that's funny. So this destructuring syntax is great. But here, I made the mistake of using destructuring. What this is really saying is get data new ID off of this, and that's not what that's not where we can get the ID. It's data contact underscore ID is how we have it in the database. And so instead of using destructuring, we just want to do this. Data.contact underscore ID. Let's see if that works. So let's create another one that's my brother, Jason Haheim. Okay, and it gave us 18. Does that sound right? Oh, yeah, 18.
Deleted a lot of times, but the numbers are still there.
Yep.
What happens when you click on the URL?
Yeah, so there's one thing, the URL doesn't have a / here, kind of rookie mistake. So let's create one more. We'll do Barry Haheim, my father. Okay, so now we've got localhost API contacts 19. Let's see what happens when we click on this. So it automatically brings us to a new request, a GET request, and we can just hit send, and there it is.
Awesome.
And you may have noticed that in the GitHub API that they did this. There were some things like when you looked up a particular repo, it's like if you wanted to know the owner, you could just click that link. And on the back, programmatically, you're going to be accessing this with code, but still you can rely on the fact that they're sending you that, and you can just go straight to that new URL. So let's keep plowing ahead because it's 11:38, and we want to make sure to finish this. So git create. Let's do our delete. Actually, let's do the update because the update is an interesting one, and it's the delete is more boring. So update. This is our update route. Now, for the purposes of this live coding, so we're going to do this as a post request. And so what we would say to our client is, if you want to update, use post. If you want to create, use put. But we're going to specify that you need to send along all the fields, and that's because of the way that we implemented that database function. We did not implement our database function to be able to take just the first name and only update the first name. Even with the post. So what I'm trying to say is post could be set up that way, but for the purposes of this live coding, to keep it a little simpler, we're going to just specify right now that you have to send all the fields. And that's because it would just take a little bit more work to write a database function that looked at which fields were sent and then tried to update only those fields, right? Because right now we have it updating all fields just by default. So let's do some copying and pasting because that's easy. So the route, the method is post. And now what's the actual path? Contacts.
Will it be by ID?
By ID, yep. So we want a /ID because we need to know which to update, which ID to update. So let's get that ID. How do we do that? Request.params. Is that right? Yeah.
Oh wait, that's a post ID. Wait, you're getting the ID from. You're doing a post and you're getting an ID from the URL parameters?
Yeah, from up here.
This is what Monica was asking about. I thought you couldn't do that with a post.
She asking about?
Why would that be?
Because in a post, isn't the information that you'll get from. Oh, I mean, I guess you can.
If we were doing a create, so this is the thing. Put and post can be used for both update and create, and there's no consensus that I've heard of that says you have to do one or the other. So if we were doing a create here, like we just did, we would not want to take in the ID. We would want to say just go to contacts. But because we're doing an update, we want them to specify what the heck it is we're updating.
Right.
And so we put that there.
I was under the impression that you would receive that ID in the body as opposed to from the URL.
It's technically possible to do that, but the pattern with REST is if you're going to be updating a specific instance, that you should access it at that route, at that path. Well, let's write this and see if that confusion is still there at the end. So we want the ID from the URL parameters. We want these things still from the body, right? And again, if we were, to do is write some code to allow them to update only, not all fields. Because right now we're saying you have to update all fields from this. So the method is update contact. And this one, isn't this cool that my editor gives us what the, in the other file, it knows that that's ID, first name, last name. I just think that's fancy. So we're going to send the ID, first name, last name, phone number. And then what we could do is just send back the data, let them know that it's updated, show them the update. So that would be data. One thing I want to look up real quick. Ta-da. HTTP status codes. So you want to be thoughtful about which ones you use. And when you create something, it's good to send back the 201. And I was just remembering that we just created something. So instead of sending back 200, let's send back 201. So here we're updating. And is there one specifically for updated? I don't know about this, but you know, we could do accepted. The request has been accepted, but what does that say? But processing has not been completed. So we still probably want to do 200. That one doesn't make sense. Okay. So if we're updating, let's just send back the contact that that we updated. And there was an error updating this information if we have a problem. So let's try this. Remember, we've got node_mon, so it refreshes, it restarts the server every time we make an update. So now we are going to not get, but let's post to, let's post to Bonnie. Bonnie's contact ID is 1, and let's update her phone number. I think we did this before. So what we're going to send in the body up here. So remember, there are two bodies. This is the request body up here. This is the response body. We already used this postman window, so that's why we have a response already. We're going to send JSON, and let's send first name. Let's keep that as Bonnie. And let's send last name. What's that?
And we're like in the post URL bar. We're at the endpoint for Bonnie.
No, we're actually at the wrong endpoint, so thanks for mentioning that. Now we're at the endpoint for Bonnie.
Okay. Now I understand.
And then phone number, phone num, and let's make this also 8675309. Yeah, and so what Debrina was asking is, I think, couldn't you just do this and then say ID 1? So it would actually be contact ID 1. And technically you could, but it's just not the pattern for REST. And I think the more that you work with REST, you'll see why.
Wait, what's not the pattern, Justin?
To send the ID that you want to edit in the body with the body instead of going to the endpoint for that. And now it makes sense. Instead of going to the endpoint for that particular contact that you want to update.
Yeah, because we're doing, the way to think of it is, this is the verb and this is the noun. And what we want to do is we want to post to contact ID 1. We don't want to post to just contacts, because we don't want to update all of contacts.
Would this turn all of them into Bonnie 1?
It depends on how we implement it on the back end. So we could implement it that way, and that wouldn't make a lot of sense. So just remember verb, noun. The noun we want to operate on is contact ID 1, which is Bonnie. And then in here, we just put the fields that we want to update.
Didn't we tell it that we were going to give it an ID?
We get the ID from the URL parameter. Take a look here. It's in the rec.params.
So we're giving our route the URL parameter to go and get that particular context object, and that's how we can identify that we're the right one by matching the ID to what's in the URL, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the thing I was confusing is the get in the post. You know how when you make a get request that you get query parameters in the URL. And I was thinking, oh, that's something that you only do with get requests, and that you don't utilize parameters in the URL ever again after that. That's what I thought it was.
Yeah.
But this makes sense.
Well, and remember, this is a URL parameter.
Right.
It's not even a query parameter. And URL parameters show up. They look to us as if it's just part of a path.
Mm-hmm.
So it looks like directories on Unix or Mac. Like This is a directory, this is a directory, this is a directory. So that's the URL parameter. Yeah, so let's give this a shot, see if it works. Send, and we get back Bonnie Shulkin 867-53099. And there she is. Cool. Pretty good. And just, oh, how did the contact ID get back in there? Oh, that's the response. And so just to kind of hit this point home, if we didn't include the phone number right now, given our current implementation, what would happen? Yeah, so that's what we've said. We've said for this particular project, you have to send all the information. Probably what's going to happen is it's just going to like blow up her phone number in the database. It's just going to become null or undefined or whatever.
Blow it up.
So, but let's give it a shot and see what happens. Yeah, so it becomes null, right? And so this is what would happen if you did a post request. Like this is the behavior that's supposed to happen if you are using put, right? Because if you send a put request and you send a first name and a last name and no phone number, your database is supposed to look like first name, last name, and no phone number. That's just the way that put is defined as an HTTP spec. Without going too far down that rabbit hole. So we've got that. Let's quick do our delete contacts route. So tell me what to do here. Delete route. What's the method? Delete. What's the path look like? That, because we want to delete a specific contact. So that's the verb, that's the noun. We get the contact ID. There's not going to be anything in the body. And then we want to call our function delete contacts, and we can see there from my handy dandy editor that it takes just the ID, and we'll send that ID. And if it's successful, what would make the most sense here? So this is probably going to send back the contact that was just deleted, and that may make sense, you know. Let's just stick with that for a second. And there was an error deleting this information. So looks pretty good, right? Okay, so let's give it a shot. As much as I love my older brother, Jason, let's get rid of him. So he is contacts 18. And now instead of a post, we're going to make a delete request. Deletes can have a body, but we do not need to send a body for any reason. So we don't actually need a content type. Cool, so let's send it. And it sends back the one contact that was deleted, and let's make sure it hit the database. Jason's gone. And the one change I would probably make, it probably makes sense just like when we create a contact to just send back the object and not an array of the object. So I think we can fix that by delete contact just being delete one. Right? And so let's delete my dear old dad. So there we go, we got just the object. And now if we try to delete something that's not there, it should give us that error. There was an error deleting this information. Y'all, we just created a legit REST API, start to finish. What do you think?
4 days.
Yeah, right.
We had a lot of questions.
Well, I love the questions, and it does make it take a long time. So,
That's what it's like when we code?
Right.
You know, and we're asking all these questions.
So many questions.
And by the way, that PG monitor thing that I was mentioning at the top that we installed, this is what it looks like. So it'll actually tell you the query that was sent to the database. So that's exactly what was sent. That's exactly what was sent. So yeah, what do you think of all this? What are you taking away? What questions do you have?
Yeah,
Mira said she's going to start watching these all again.
I am too. And we have access to the Git repository, right?
Yep. Yeah, that would actually, you know, if I had to recommend the kind of best way to get yourself back up to speed with this, just look at the repository, because you all have been here basically the whole time, I think, and so you guys know the whole evolution of it, and I think just looking at the code, you'll probably be able to remember all of this.
Before, when I learned how to write, the routes for the stack project, I didn't know how these things worked independently of each other, like the front end versus the database versus the middleware versus the routes. I didn't know how they, like, to me, they depended on each other.
Yep.
And so when someone would say, oh, in the project, let's start with our routes, I'd be like, how? We need to do everything at the same time. But now I see how an API really works and it stands alone. It can stand alone.
Yep.
And I didn't know that.
Yeah, isn't that great? I mean, I love that you pointed that out. We could have written this this entire API. We could have written this entire thing without any database functions written. We could just say, in the future, we will write a get all contacts, get contact, whatever. So we know the API that we want, and let's just write some routes based on that. There's nothing else that we need to know about what's happening on the database end. It's like similarly the body parser middleware. We don't need to know, for our code to work, we don't need to know anything about the specific implementation. We do because we've been talking about it and because I want to make sure that you know how it's working and why it's working. But you could write these routes without having put body parser in yet, and then you just have to put it in at the end. And similarly, you could write the documentation for your API. Hey, everybody, here's our API. Send us JSON. We'll send you JSON back. Here's the path to go to /API. Here's one of the endpoints, contacts. You could write all of that out and tell people how to use it. If you want to make an update, you send us a post request, all of that, before even running a line of code. And that's what you were pointing to, is that these things really are independent, and that's the mark of good code, is when it's modular and you can plug one thing out and plug another thing in. If all of a sudden we wanted to use, have you guys heard of MongoDB?
Yeah.
It's a NoSQL database. It would be trivial to do that, because all we would have to do is swap out this database utilities file for a different database utilities file, and in that other one, implement the functions that we need to access a Mongo database.
So you should be able to pick your server out and just or your API out and just plug it into the project, and the front end could use it.
Yeah, I mean, there's no real reason that we couldn't just take this sucker out altogether and put it into some other server.
It really is like you're building little machines. Now you take that part off.
Yeah, I'm going to repeat what you said for the video. It's like you're building little machines, and they work together, and they just each has a function. I mean, that's what you're doing when you're writing functions, is you're little machines to do something. So cool. I'll post this. The video is up from yesterday, but I didn't get it on Slack, so I'll post both of those momentarily.